Okay, so we'll get started. If anyone joins after, I'll send the source sheet again. So our topic today that we're going to be discussing is the topic of Akedas Yitzchak. Akedas Yitzchak plays a really significant central role, really throughout the whole Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur experience, particularly on Rosh Hashanah, and that really expresses itself in many different ways. One way is that most obviously that the Akedah is featured as part of the Kriyas HaTorah on Rosh Hashanah. Part of the Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah is Akedah Yitzchak. We read about Akedah Yitzchak as part of the Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah. So whenever time something is included as part of the Torah reading, so it's a good assumption that it's something which is significant and worthy of note within the context of that holiday. But if that weren't enough, just the fact that we sort of include it in the Kriyas HaTorah, we also know, and this is at source number 2, if anyone's following along in the source sheet, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah points out that we say, Amar Rav Abahu said, Lama tokim b'shofar shel ayil, why do we blow with a shofar? Why do we specifically use a shofar which comes from a ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah? Alma Kadosh Baruch Hu, because God says, Tiku lefanai b'shofar shel ayil. You should blow on a shofar a shofar of a ram, so I'm going to remember Akedas Yitzchak ben Avraham. So that I'm going to be the merit of Akedas Yitzchak ben Avraham is going to be sort of called up before me. And then we say Umala ani aleichem, and then I'm going to treat it as though kilu akadatem atzmachem lefanei, like you kind of were participating in the Akedas Yitzchak. You actually yourselves were bound up in Akedas Yitzchak. So here you see, Akash Baruch Hu is basically saying that shofar, which is the central mitzvah that we have of Rosh Hashanah, the central mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah is somehow all based in the Akedah. So the central mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah is based in the Akedah. The Torah reading is based on the Akedah. And lastly, we'll see source number 3, actually the davening itself is highly inspired by the Akedah. This is in the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. We say, Lokinu v'le'avasinu zachrinu b'zichron tov lefanecha. And then we continue on and ask Hakadosh Baruch Hu for all these wonderful things that he should remember us favorably. And the thing that we quote as the zechus, as the merit, why Hakadosh Baruch Hu should remember us favorably on Rosh Hashanah, is to remember the vow that he took, Asher Nishpat al Avram Avinu Bahara Moriah, the vow that you swore to Avram Avinu on Har HaMoriah, that you swore to him during the Akedah. So we're saying to Hakadosh Baruch Hu effectively during the davening, remember the Akedah during davening, and that's going to be the merit that we're going to have. So first of all, we see that we have the Kriyas HaTorah. That's based off of the Akedah in some ways, or is really about the Akedah. Second, the central mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah of the shofar, we also know is connected to the Akedah. And lastly, the davening, the tefillah of Rosh Hashanah is based off of the Akedah. So here we've seen 3 different separate areas of Rosh Hashanah, all significant areas of Rosh Hashanah, which are all kind of based on and really sort of connected to the Akedah. So the question that we sort of have to grapple with here is, so why is the Akedah so central? Why is the Akedah so important in the context of Rosh Hashanah, that the shofar is based off of the Akedah, the central mitzvah, that the davening is based in some ways off of the Akedah, and lastly also that the Kriyas HaTorah is in many ways based off of the Akedah. I'm seeing that there are some new people, so I'm going to resend on the chat the source sheet so that everyone's able to follow along in the sources. So we'll just send that one more time on the source sheet. Okay, so that should be in the chat now for anyone who would like to follow along with me. So we've seen that the Akedah is something which is really sort of central. And what we have to kind of figure out, and this is really going to be a little bit our goal this evening, we have to figure out is why is it the Akedah plays such a pivotal role in Rosh Hashanah? What is it about the Akedah that really we're meant to connect to on Rosh Hashanah? So I'd like to talk about basically 2 different visions of the Akedah, of what the Akedah looks like. One is going to be a little bit more familiar to all of us. One's going to be sort of closer to the version of the Akedah that we're used to. And the second one is going to be maybe a little bit different than the version of the Akedah than we're used to. So we're going to talk about 2 different versions of the Akedah. So the first vision of the Akedah, I think, really kind of clearly jumps out at us if we look at the verses themselves. And if you look at source number 1 on the source sheet that I sent out on the chat, So if you look at source number 1, I gave you essentially almost the entire story of the Akedah, both the Hebrew and the English. And if you just sort of think back towards the story of the Akedah, there are a couple things which are very noteworthy. First of all, there are very, very few characters in the Akedah. Certainly very few characters who play a central role. So we know that there are characters. Who's the main character of the Akedah? Who is the main character of the Akedah? Anyone can jump in. Okay, so Avram, right? Avram is probably the central figure, the central sort of character of the Akedah. Very few other people say almost anything at all during the course of the Akedah. Who's absent in the Akedah? So Sarah, entirely absent in the Akedah. Very central figure in the rest of Abraham's life, plays an important role in pretty much every other areas, every story that Avram's involved in. Sarah, nowhere to be seen. It's her child, but she's nowhere to be seen. In fact, there's actually an interesting Midrash that Avram kind of has to trick Sarah, that he tells her, oh, we're going to Har Moriah for a different reason. And he actually comes up with a different reason why he's going there. So that's the only way that Sarah even gets a little bit of dialogue, even in the Midrashim. Yitzchak, who's the person who's actually being sacrificed, almost no dialogue. He asks his father one question. His father kind of says a sort of unsatisfactory. He asks his father, where's the animal? His father says, oh, don't worry about it, basically. And then Yitzchak says nothing. He's totally absent for the rest of the Akedah. He's absent for the binding. He's absent for, afterwards when he's switched out and he's saved. He doesn't say anything. And he's absent also afterwards, right? Only Avram goes down from the mountain. Yitzchak doesn't go down from the mountain. Something that a lot of different Rishonim pick up on. So really the central figure is really, really Abraham. You get very, very little dialogue throughout the whole story of the Akedah. Pretty much the story of the Akedah is Avram goes and does something. It's very action focused. Avram takes the knife. He binds Yitzchak. He walks up the mountain. It's very, very action focused. And this is very surprising because I think if you were to take a poll and you were to ask people kind of what is the most emotional story in all of Tanakh, definitely in the top 5 is the Akedah, right? Man sacrificing his son, because God told him to. That's in the top 5 of the most emotional stories. And yet in that story, there's almost no emotion which is expressed. There's almost no dialogue which is expressed. There's almost no back and forth. It's just Avram pretty much by himself taking action after action. And so this kind of plays into a vision of the Akedah where Avram is sort of the soul, to borrow the phrase that Kierkegaard liked to use and the Rav talked about as well, or Soloveitchik, is sort of the knight of faith. He's the one who's going to do this himself to follow God's will, and he's not having any back and forth. He's not having any second thoughts while he's doing this. And if you look at source number 4, this is really picked up in the Midrash as well. The Midrash describes how Abraham and Yitzchak as well, in different Midrashim, are basically the Satan comes up to them and tries to trick them so that or try to talk to them to convince them not to go through the Akedah. Interesting that the Satan is the one here who's saying, no, maybe don't kill your kid. And each Midrash sort of has different variations of the back and forth between Abraham and Yitzchak and the Satan. But the one that I included here is the one from Beishas Rabbah. And in Beishas Rabbah, Abraham is talking to the Satan. And the Satan says to him, think for a moment. Just think for a second what you're doing here. Last year, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told you that you were going to have Yitzchak, and Yitzchak was going to be your ticket to having a nation. Right? Through Yitzchak, you're going to have a nation. Now he's telling you, go kill this son. Does that make a lot of sense? Like, who knows what's going on here? And Avram says, you know what? When I am going to do the Akedah, I understood, built into this, is that Yitzchak, my one chance of getting a nation, built into that, I understood that that chance was going to be lost. And then he says, well, maybe next time he's going to go and tell you, tomorrow he's going to go and tell you, I told you to kill Yitzchak, but nonetheless, you're still a murderer. You still did something wrong. Because again, he's doing something which is deeply unethical, right? He's killing his son. And Avram says, yeah, I get that. That's all part of the package. I totally understand that. So here are all these sort of like ethical dilemmas that the Satan is sort of throwing at him. And what's Yitzchak's response? What's Avram's response? He says, yeah, I get that. Don't worry. I have total and complete faith in what I'm doing. That all of these sort of philosophical and ethical problems that you're raising, problems that might even sort of like strike at the height of what we're doing, of my sort of very, very morality, not worrying about it. Right? This is Avram, the knight of faith. He's not worried about any sort of ethical, moral considerations. He's not worried about anything other than following what he's absolutely and totally convinced is the will of God. Even when the Satan tries to convince him that maybe this is not the will of God, because God had told him previous things in the past, and he knows that God also doesn't want him to kill people. Even when he's trying to be convinced, when he tries to convince him of all those things, Avram says, you know what? I'm sticking on the path. right? He's a figure who has a tremendous amount of confidence. I see there's just a bunch of people who added, so I'm going to send one last time. I'm going to just send the source sheet on the chat so everyone's able to follow along. Okay, so the source sheet, I just sent the source sheet once again on the chat, so everyone's able to follow along. Okay, and so we're at source number 5. Source number 5 is the Midrash Agada, also from Bereshis, also talking about the world of the whole story of the Akid. Midrash Agada says as follows: yachta. So we know after Yitzchak asks Avram the question, he gives him a rather unsatisfactory response, and then he says to him, and then they sort of the Torah says that they walked together. They walked together up the mountain, and then the Midrash comments, Kishem shahaya Avraham sameach lishchot, just as Avraham was happy to slaughter or to kill, but right, you could pause there, right? That's striking, right? Avraham is killing his son. I understand maybe thinking, well, God told me to, I have to, I'm forced to, but the idea that Avraham is somehow happy to be doing this, that's sort of striking. And then we say, Kach Yitzchak sameach lishachar. Similarly, Yitzchak was also happy to be the one who was being killed. And so here, what you have is like something which is remarkable. The Midrash is saying not only was Abraham totally confident, what we saw in the previous Midrash on what he's doing, that even any moral and theological sort of calculations, he wasn't willing to listen to them at all. He's happy to go and do what he's doing. He's confident and he's happy to do what he's doing. He's totally a one-track mind. He totally just wants to follow this precise command of God. And he doesn't have any back and forth. Forget about any kind of wishy-washy feelings about this. Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? He's happy with what he's doing. And this really comes to this idea in the Midrash, this sort of midrashic idea, really, I think, comes like to its pinnacle in the following few lines from Bereshis Rabbah, source number 6. The Malach tells Abraham, "Vayomer al tishlach yadcha, don't send your hand to kill this boy." And the Midrash wants to know what happened to the knife. So they say, well, okay, something interesting happened to the knife. The angels started crying. The angel started crying, and it sort of incinerated the knife. There's no more knife because the angel's tears did away with the knife. So now Avram's standing there without the knife. So what is he supposed to do? He says, Amar lo, he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go suffocate Yitzchak. Meaning clearly there's already a sign from heaven. The angels are crying. And basically, HaKadosh Baruch Hu pretty much almost told him, don't do this. And he says, I'm going to go find a different way that I can go do the Ekid. And then he says, Al tishlach yadcha el anar. And then he says, you know what? Don't touch the kid. Don't suffocate the kid. You don't have a knife. Don't kill the kid. Don't do anything to the kid. And then Abraham responds to the Malach, and this obviously is not in the Psukim. In the Midrash says, Amar lo, otzi mimenu tipas dam. He says, at least let me take a little bit of blood for my son. Imagine you're Abraham for a second, right? If I'm Abraham and God just tells me I was following this command, which I would imagine I was doing begrudgingly, right? The Midrash told us that he's happy to do this. But I would have said, I don't want this to happen. This is a horrible, horrific thing that I'm being forced to do. When I'm told that I'm off free, I'm jumping for joy. This is amazing. What does Abraham say? Can I at least do a little bit of a cut? Can I at least do something that I feel like I can have some kind of feeling that I've followed God's command in this? Abraham's so on this sort of one-track mind, he's totally wants to follow God's command to 100%, that even when he's told no, he's still got a little bit part of him that wants to follow this, that wants to do this. And this idea in the Midrashim is really picked up and taken almost to a totally different level in the world of the Piyutim of medieval Ashkenaz. So medieval Ashkenaz is a place, and for much of medieval Ashkenaz, was not a very happy place to live, because there were a lot of pogroms. There was a lot of really, really horrible tragedies. There was the Crusades, and many different sort of liturgical works that we have surround the Crusades. And even though there was a lot of death, there was really a lot of the height of Ashkenazic poetry really comes from that period. And there's an entire genre of piyutim, of liturgical poetry written by Ashkenazi Rabbanim that surrounds the idea of the Akedah. But it really blends the Akedah with their own sort of experiences with martyrdom. Because, of course, martyrdom is perhaps not an everyday experience in Ashkenaz, but is an experience that they're familiar with. An experience in a way that maybe we're not familiar with today, which is people come in and they're either forcibly converted or they're going to be killed, and they have to die al Kiddush Hashem. So this is an idea, obviously, that maybe we have a little bit more of a sense of what that looks like this year than in previous years. But this is an idea I think is largely foreign to us. But this was something which is very much a part of their everyday lives. And so they sort of blending the theme of the Akedah, looking backwards towards the Akedah, towards the image of the Akedah, to think about what does it mean to die al Kiddush Hashem. Yitzchak is almost the perfect example of someone who was willing to be sacrificed al Kiddush Hashem. So they kind of build off of this idea of Yitzchak and different variations of Yitzchak to hint at kind of certain things going on related to the contemporary martyrdom of Ashkenaz. And there's really a wonderful article I'm happy to send it to anyone who would like, written by Shulamit Elitzur, which actually talks about how the piyutim about the Akedah between Ashkenaz and Sfarad are totally different. Because the piyutim in Ashkenaz are actually describe the Akedah as a very happy event, because they want to sort of support, sort of bolster theologically the idea of martyrdom, which is really a significant element of Ashkenaz for some period of time. And it's actually really is a shir for another time, but it's actually something which is really quite revolutionary in many ways. The way in which they engage in some of the ways that they are dying al Kiddush Hashem, the idea of active martyrdom, this is really a whole shir in itself. But this sort of revolutionary what's going on in Ashkenaz. In Sfarad, by and large, they were really not contending with the Akedah in that kind of way, as a symbol related to martyrdom. And because they're not contending with this with Akedah in that way, the Akedah actually takes on a very different tenor. We're going to see this a little bit later on in this year. So I just want to give a couple of different examples where it's clear that many of the different themes that I was picking up on in the Midrashim and in the text as well really come out as well from different sort of liturgical poems and piyutim that were written in Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages. Look at source number 7. So one of the things that immediately pops out, line number 2, V'sas v'cholev al devarecha la'aso so. And that Abraham wanted to joyously go and do the actions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, not this idea that he's begrudgingly going, he's going because God told him to, but he's happy that he's going to do this. And similarly, you see this other idea, this is in Rav Ephraim Mibuna. This is source number 8. This is Yitzchak talking to Avram. And Yitzchak says, Picha tiftach avi b'shevach, ki hu yivarech hazevach. It says basically, Yitzchak says, make a bracha on me, right? You should make a bracha on, seems like the shlita, when you actually kill me. So here, this is part of a little bit the shift of how Ashkenaz began to think about the idea of dying al Kiddush Hashem. They began to see themselves in many ways as Kohanim. What they were doing was almost a sacred act, which makes sense kind of contextually with what they were forced to deal with. And so then again, this is an idea that not that they're sort of begrudgingly forced to do, but they're joyfully running to do, and they're turning this into a mitzvah. They're turning this into a kind of kadosh act. What's also interesting is I mentioned at the beginning that oftentimes you don't really see an active role for Yitzchak. Really, one of the exceptions to this, both in Midrashim and also in Piyutim, is when Yitzchak is basically totally and 100% agreeing with what Abraham is doing. And this you see in for source number 9, where we see that Yitzchak actually leans out his neck to be able to be killed by Abraham. So he's a willing participant. And you can see how in an Ashkenazi community where we were talking about oftentimes having even children having to engage in dying al Kiddush Hashem, this was a very, very powerful image to work with. So really you see here, and we'll skip just for the moment, the two different sources from Gzeirat Ashkenaz V'Tzarfat. These are both kind of chronicles of pretty much 1096, which is one of the massacres that occurred in Germany. And there you see very similar descriptions. Kasher Yagil Moti Shalal B'Shalalo, and that they were like a Chassan and Kala, people who were acting as martyrs. So there's a kind of a joy which is built on this idea that we saw in the Midrashim of the Akedas Yitzchak being something which really happens. It's a joyous event that he's totally on board with, that Yitzchak and Avram are totally together with, and that this sort of like remarkable act of faith, this night of faith, that's even willing to suspend any kind of sort of ethical considerations, right? Kierkegaard calls this the teleological suspension of the ethical, right? That Avram's not concerned about anything else, he just wants to follow the will of God. So you see this in the history of Ashkenaz as they kind of contended with the Akedah themselves, in Piyutim, in Chronicles. You see this in various different Midrashim. You see this even a little bit in the text. And I think that really this is why this sort of world of Midrashim really sees the zechus, the merit of the Akedas Yitzchak, which we're kind of appealing to on Rosh Hashanah in a very specific way. Look at source number 12. This is the Yalkut Shimoni. It appears also in some of the Balei Atosos Ala Torah. So the Yalkut Shimoni says as follows. Basically, Avram calls the place for Hashem Yira'eh, and then he says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as follows. He says, I suppressed my rachamim, my mercy. I suppressed my mercy, and I was willing to do what you want. Kavashi rachami la'asos ritzonecha. Just as I suppressed my mercy to do your will, so too, when your children go and do averos, tia niskar lahem ha'avoda hazos, this situation, this story where I suppress my mercy, should be reminded to them, v'tamale alehem rachamim, and you should have mercy on them. In other words, in some sense, because Abraham was this knight of faith, who totally suppressed his mercy, who totally almost acted in a way that was not human in some ways, he's earned in some sense, he's like sort of the merit that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to act with the Jewish people with mercy, right? He suppressed his mercy, God's going to act with mercy, but this is almost like Avram is appealing to a certain merit that he now has, which we're using every Rosh Hashanah. And this is, I think, kind of in many ways, maybe not with all the sort of gory details that I went through in the Midrashim, but this is very much the way that we think we think about the Akedah. Avram is a confident character. He's going in 100%. He's built in 100%. Maybe we don't often go as far as thinking that maybe he would want to go through with the Akedah even after he's told that he's not to. But this is a night of faith, right? He's doing this tremendous, tremendous act of faith. And that is why really we're invoking him on Rosh Hashanah when we need every kind of merit that we can get, because this merit, which he did by doing this tremendous act of faith, is going to serve us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to act mercifully towards us in the future. So that's I think position number one. One way of viewing the story of the Akedah, one way of viewing the story of how the Akedah really is serving as a zechus, as a merit for us, even even today on Rosh Hashanah. So that's position number one. I'll tell you, this way of kind of viewing the Akedah was always very, very difficult for me. Certainly, it's very inspiring. It's inspiring to think about someone like Abraham acting in such a way that he has complete and utter faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it's also something which is not really in any way something that I can even think about relating to, right? Meaning, in some ways, the story of the Akedah is so distant from me that when I listen to it, I almost don't. It's almost like not an emotional story for me. It's like, what's going on here, right? Here you have this person, Avram. It's his kid, right? You like almost want to shout out during Kriyas Torah, like, this is this guy's kid. And now he's happy? Like, that's so distant from any kind of thing that I'm able to relate to, that it's really almost not something that I feel like necessarily one can clearly gain from, that one can clearly glean from. And so maybe kind of in kind of some metaphysical way, the different merits that Avram had and, that he amounted in his pile, maybe are going to go to the Jewish people in Rosh Hashanah in some way. But it's not something which necessarily maybe there's a clear takeaway that we're able to apply in our own lives, that we're able to sort of grasp from the Kriyas Torah, from the Torah reading, when we hear the shofar, that we're able to hear from Get the Shofar. It's a very, very distant idea. Sometimes I hear like different stories about Gedolim in history. This person only slept like 1 hour a night. This person only did all these kinds of like very aesthetic practices. And I feel like in some ways this is like, it's so far distant from my life and so far distant from something that I relate to, that it's almost like counterproductive to tell me, because like it's not even something which I'm reaching to, which I'm looking to be inspired, which I would be inspired by. It's almost like a different universe from where I'm standing. And I would go like even a little bit further, which is that the story of the Akedah, I think, is something which, at least I'll speak for myself, but I think it's not just me. I hope it's not just me. It's something that we like really struggle with. It's a really difficult thing to understand theologically. How this person who was willing to go out to bat for Sodom and Amorah, right? He doesn't even go out to bat for his own kid, right? He's totally fine, just saying, you know what? Kodesh Baruch Hu said so. We're getting on the donkey. We're going. Right? He doesn't even go and clearly daven for Yitzchak, at least in this depiction. So this is a very, very difficult thing to understand theologically. And so really for the last part of the shir, I want to shift to perhaps a different way of understanding the Akedah, one that I think maybe is a little bit more relevant to our lives. So to do this, we're going to take a dive back into the world of the Midrash. And in the Midrashim, so I mentioned that there's all these different Midrashim that Avram was happy. There's all these different Midrashim, about all these different actions of Avram. But as is typically the case when it comes to Midrashim, for every Midrash that you can find, I can find you an opposite Midrash that says pretty much the opposite thing. And both of them are expressing important themes and important ideas. So look at source number 13. This is from the Otzar Midrashim, Midrash Vayosha, which is where it originally comes from. It's a very short Midrash, it's only a couple of pages, but this is a part of a collection of different Midrashim. And here we describe how, sort of in contrast, the idea of Abraham as being like a chassid and kala, and he's super happy. In contrast, here it says, Demos mi Avram nosos v'noflos al Yitzchak Yitzchak noflos al Eitzim v'hayasakin itfelas b'demos. So here we say that literally tears were falling totally off of Avram's face. He's literally sobbing, and they fall on Yitzchak, and from Yitzchak they fall on the wood, right? And the knife is totally almost like drenched and almost like it's been immersed in their tears, which means they're crying, right, a lot. Right? Each of them are crying a lot. It's not something which they're joyfully going into. It's not something which they have sort of no question marks about. It's something that they're sad about. It's something that they're really struggling with. They're still doing it. They're still fulfilling the will of God, but it's something that they're really struggling with. And you actually said something interesting. I mentioned earlier the role of Yitzchak and how is Yitzchak playing a role here? Is he an active participant? Is he just sort of entirely on board, as we saw in some of the Piyutim, with what Avram's doing? Look at source number 14. Where the Midrash says that we don't have, two different words said together for no reason. We have, but he says, Yitzchak says to Avram, he says, Avi, Avi, right? He says twice the words, my father, my father. So why is that? He said that Kadesha Timala alav rachamim, so that he would be filled with mercy for him. Meaning Yitzchak's freaking out. He's this frightened child whose father is about to sacrifice him, and he says, Father, Father. He keeps calling out his father's name because he's hoping that his father will have mercy on him. This is not the Yitzchak who's sticking out his neck, who's saying, I'm building the Mizbeach because I'm like a chassan and kala. This is the Yitzchak who says, I don't know if we're doing the right thing here. I'm not sure if what we're doing is the right thing. And I'm davening and I'm hoping that my father, his mercy, his sort of parental instincts, his mercy will kick in over here. So this is a very different view of what the role that Yitzchak is playing. What about for Abraham? What's the role of Abraham here? So we see already maybe Abraham's crying. One of the most striking things I alluded to earlier is that Abraham doesn't pray, right? There's no explicit mention in the Pesukim of Abraham praying. Abraham spends a lot of time praying for Sodom, for very bad people. He prays for a lot of people. Abraham prays for a lot of people. Who doesn't he pray for? For his own son not to be sacrificed. However, so that's at least in the just from reading the verses themselves. However, the Mishnah in Taanis sounds like actually that Abraham did pray. The Mishnah in Taanis is discussing different things that you say, and he says, Misha, one of the examples is, and we say this oftentimes, Misha Anna as Abraham Bahar Mahamoria, Huya Anna Eschem. The person who answered Abraham Bahar Hamoria, he is going to answer you. In other words, because Abraham was answered on Hamoria, Yitzchak was saved, Abraham was davening. As Abraham is building the Mizbeach, as he's putting the different bits of wood, as he's tying Yitzchak up, he's davening. He says, please, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, stop this. So maybe we don't get this in the Pesukim, but at least in the world of the Midrash, all of a sudden, Abraham's not jumping in. He's not saying after the command, maybe, no, I still want to do something. I want a little bit more of a drop of blood. What is he saying? Please. And every second he's praying, please, God, stop this from happening. And so this is like a little bit of a different story. All of a sudden, Avram's crying. Yitzchak's begging to be let out. And Avram's praying to God that this is not going to happen. This is not the same confident night of faith, but this is Avram saying, look, what's going on here? What are we doing? Like, I totally don't understand what's going on here. Maybe I have a Yehuda HaKadosh Baruch Hu has some kind of plan, but I'm on board with this, right? It's a very, very different perspective. So this perspective is, I actually think, really beautifully developed, and this, again, some of this is coming from, at least the stuff about the Piyutim is coming from various different articles from Shulamit Elitzur, who's a wonderful academic who's written a lot about different Piyutim. So I mentioned she talks about a divide between Ashkenaz and Sfarad. So there is a very, very well-known piyut, liturgical poem, which is said, I think, in almost every single Sephardi community, which is called Eish Sha'arei Ratzon. It was written by Rabbi Yehuda ben Shmuel ibn Abbas, and it was actually written around the same time as the other different liturgical poems that we're discussing. But as we're going to see, it has a very, very different tenor. And I actually think that if we just sort of pick out a couple of different sections from this, you'll see that many of the different midrashim and motifs that we've been kind of trying to develop really are expressed in this piyut, in this poem. So look at source number 16. Now we're on page 6. Okay, so we're on the second paragraph. So I'll just cut out a couple of different lines here and there. We're obviously not going to read the whole thing, but it's actually quite a beautiful poem. It's really, really beautiful. It's a little bit unfortunate that as Ashkenazim, we don't read it. But maybe you'll go to a Sephardi. Maybe this will inspire you to go to a Sephardi shul. I don't know if Spanish Portuguese does, but I'm sure there's other places that do. Okay, so the second paragraph says as follows. So Hakadosh Baruch Hu is talking about telling Abraham, please sacrifice your son. And one of the things that he says, so we know there's this very ambiguous way that Hakadosh Baruch Hu asks him, Bincha, Yechidcha, Yitzchak, and Rashi has this whole way of understanding that Avram tries to say, well, I have two sons, and there's this kind of back and forth. Immediately, we're told that the 10th test that Avram had, Haben Asher Nolad Lo Misara. The one who you really, really love, who your soul is tied up with, and the one who is born from Sarah. Here, there's no ambiguity. Here, Sarah is explicitly mentioned, right? And also, we're told explicitly, right, the one who you really love. So here, immediately, this is not something which Hakadosh Baruch Hu is saying, just send him off, but there's an emotional component here, which is being acknowledged, built into the story. Here, just sort of, if you go skip across a bunch of different lines, he says, Avi raz eish ve'etz so I have to read a little bit like in more of a Sephardi way than my typical Havara. But he says, but so this is the part of the story where Yitzchak is talking to Avram, and he says, where is the animal that's supposed to be slaughtered? And he says, where? So up until this point, it's normal. He says, where is the animal so we can have a proper korban? And then he says, do you forget? So here he says, is it possible that you forgot? So here, all of a sudden, you have Yitzchak a little bit pushing back to Avram, right? Meaning he's skeptical, right? Is it possible that he actually, at this day of all days, he forgot where it is? So here you have Yitzchak is playing a little bit of an active role. Also, this is true for the phrase that kind of repeats over and over again throughout the Piyut. Oked v'haneked v'hamizbeach, right? Here you have the oked, the person who's binding, but also the nekad, right? The oked v'hanekad, meaning the person who is both bound, and also the person who is binding. So here you have both Avraham and Yitzchak mentioned over and over again. So Avram's not the sole person who's playing a role in the in this story. Now you have both Avraham and Yitzchak playing a role in this story. But really, I think like where this some of the themes that we're talking about comes to a little bit closer. If you sort of skip down a paragraph, Dafku b'shari sharmayim liftoach. They okay, S&P does recite this. Okay, that is good to know. And there's a recording. Okay, actually, I listen to the recordings all the time. They're really great. They have albums also. So okay. So that's good to know that they recite this. So we say Dafku b'shari shamayim rachamim liftoach, that they pounded on the Sharei Shamayim that they would answer. In other words, both Abraham and Yitzchak were both praying that this would change. So this is not, they're both walking together, they're not super sameach. Here they're praying to God, which is not something you have in the Pesukim, but you have in the Midrashim, and here this liturgical poem is picking up on this. And here you have a little bit at the end of this paragraph, an expression of the mixed emotions which are going on here. You have the Lev Sameach, but you also have Ayin Bamar Bocheh V'Lev Sameach, meaning you have, on the one hand, really like sort of crying in tears, but you also have Lev Sameach. You also have a joyous heart. So here there are some mixed emotions. On the one hand, they want to follow the will of God, but they're also in a lot of pain. So they're like, this is not the idea of Avraham and Yitzchak as really sort of the knights of faith who are totally crushing their sort of human side and their human emotion, but really they're actually going through this, appreciating in some sense, at least in a more limited way, their kind of vulnerability as they're sort of crying and praying for this not to happen. And this, I think, actually takes a little bit of it shifts a little bit what the zechus, what the merit is that's precisely going on that connects the Akedah to Yom Kippur. So look at the second to last paragraph here. Here we say, so Amar Avram Adon Shamayim, Al Tishlach Yad, etc., etc. Yom Zeh Zechus LeBnei Yerushalayim. So this day is going to be a merit for the people of Yerushalayim, for the Jewish people. Bo Sharei Rachamim Ani Poteach. So again, the Sharei Rachamim, the gates of mercy that were being prayed for to be opened by Avram and Yitzchak. Now Hakadosh Baruch Hu is saying, I am going to open them. Oked v'nekad the Hamizbeach. So now we're saying the gates of mercy are actually going to open on on Yom Kippur, but it's not because of anything per se that was done by them that they chose to go through the Akedah, but it's in a way actually their prayer to God, right? That we actually opened up the Sharei Rachamim, that now God is going to continue to open up throughout the time. So we have the merit shifts a little bit, right? The merit is pretty much from on top, that God is going to have mercy on us because we prayed for mercy, because we said we don't really know what we're doing here, right? This situation is so contrary to the way that we would normally think we're supposed to act sort of ethically and everything that we know from what God typically expects of us. And also sort of on a human level, this is something which is very emotionally difficult. We open ourselves up, we cry, and we pray to God. And God says, because of that, now we're going to open up Sharei Rachamim on Rosh Hashanah. And that's the connection really on some level to begin with, to sort of on a very basic level between Rosh Hashanah and the Akedah. But I think that it goes a little bit further. Look at source number 17. So we'll move back from the liturgical poetry to the Midrash. Here you really have a fascinating Midrash. This is in Bereshis Rabbah. So here we saw earlier Midrash where it was the Satan who was trying to basically say to Abraham, yesterday Akash Baruch Hu told you were going to have a whole nation come from Yitzchak. Today he's telling you, go shech Yitzchak. Tomorrow maybe he's going to call you a murderer. And that was kind of the dialogue. Here you have a very similar conversation, but actually Abraham is raising it when he's talking to Hakadosh Baruch Hu. And he says, yesterday, Etzmola Marta, ki beYitzchak ikar lechazera. Yesterday you told me that Yitzchak is going to be the source of me getting a nation, of me sort of a nation coming from me. So chazarta v'amarta kafna es bincha. Then you told me, go take your son and bring him as a karban. And now you're telling me, al tishlach yada el hanar, and now you're going to tell me, don't kill him. Meaning, make up your mind. First, you told me, he's going to be the guy. Then we told him, kill him. And then we said, no, save the child. So Avram's the one who's saying to Kadosh Baruch Hu, I don't understand what's going on here. So you see, first of all, that's a very, very different conversation than when the Satan says this to Avram, and Avram says, you know what, I don't understand the back and forth and the shift between Kadosh Baruch Hu, but it's not my place. I'm just sort of the knight of faith. I'm walking through 100%. Here, Avram's really struggling with it. He's saying, I don't understand how this is going to work out. How does this make any sense? And then Kadosh Baruch Hu says something very striking to him. He says, this is used by actually sort of a lot of different modern readings of the Akedah. He says, I never told you to kill Yitzchak. He says, I never told you to kill Yitzchak. All I told you to do is Alehu, right? Bring him up, literally bring him up. I never told you to kill Yitzchak. So imagine you're Avram here. Avram is about to go kill his son. And then all of a sudden he figures out he misunderstood what he was going to do the whole time. If it hadn't been for the Malach, right, he would have killed his son and he would have misunderstood what God was telling him to do. So here with Avram, he had all this amount of confidence, right? He maybe in this telling, right, he was crying, he was praying, but he had all this confidence and he was wrong. And so the end moment of the Akedah, at the very end, when God tells him, don't kill your son, right, is actually the moment when Avram realizes, maybe I didn't really understand what was going on after all. Maybe I didn't understand what was going on the entire time. Because I thought what I was supposed to be doing was sacrificing my son, and actually God was asking something very different from me. Rav Re'em HaKohen, who is a Rosh Yeshiva in Otniel in Eretz Yisrael, a very, very creative thinker. He has a sefer on Rosh Hashanah. And he goes through his theory of Avraham Avinu. And he calls Avraham Avinu Ish Hariyah, the person who literally is the man of sight. Right? We see he's Roes Hamakom Mirachok at the beginning. He sees the place from afar. He sees the men from afar. He sees all these different things from afar. He's very farsighted, right? Avraham Avinu is a revolutionary figure. He's a figure who's able to see things far beyond any time that he's going to live, right? He's able to see the Bris Ben Asarim. He's able to understand going down to Egypt. He's able to understand Jewish history far beyond the place where he's actually going to live. And he's able to understand that the world in which he lives doesn't necessarily need to be what the world is today, right? He founds monotheism. Think about what percentage of the world today is monotheistic. He had the capability to be Roa Mirachok. He saw something from afar and he said, you know what? We can do this. It's not the reality on the ground today, but let's build towards a world that's different, right? That's what's so remarkable about Abraham. But he says the Akedah is actually a bit of a shift, right? So immediately after what we just talked about, where Abraham figures out that maybe he wasn't 100% right, right? So what does he do? He sacrifices the ram, and he calls the place something important. He calls it Hashem Yira'eh. That this is what we eventually call Yushalayim. We say God will see, or God sees. And this idea, he says, represents a shift in how Abraham saw himself. He says, once he saw the ram stuck there in the thicket, he saw that everything wasn't so clear. It wasn't so pashut. The whole world was more complicated than what he'd previously seen. And I would add, right, where's that moment sort of coming off on the backs of? When he just realized that this command that God gave him is actually a command that he misunderstood. This extreme action that he was going to do, this extreme act of faith, is something he misunderstood. The world is far more complicated than he understood. The ram is stuck in the thicket, or the metaphor of that. And then he says that there's a world where there's all kinds of challenges, where there's all kinds of different sorrows. And then he realizes that even though someone can see mirachok, even though when you see mirachok, if you see things from afar, you're able to understand a lot, there's a limitation in what you're able to understand. You're not always able to understand all of the different pieces of how everything is able to fit together. But he really realizes Hashem Yira'eh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is different, right? God is the one who's able to actually understand the scoop of history. He's actually able to understand how all the different pieces come together. When I try to act almost divine, when I act like the knight of faith, when I act like I'm totally on board, 100%, and you have that confidence, that joy, you almost like act like God, as though you have no svekos whatsoever. You know exactly what's supposed to happen. You know exactly what's going to happen. You miss the boat. Therefore, he names it Hashem Yireh. He's the one who got what was supposed to understand what was supposed to happen in the Akedah. I missed the boat when it came to the Akedah. He's the one who got what was supposed to. Akash Baruch Hu was the one who got what was supposed to happen when it came to the Akedah. And that's why he calls the place Hashem Yireh. Hu Haroeh, says Rav Aim, below Hadam. God is the one who understands what's going on, below Hadam, and not man. Man's not the one who's able to understand what goes on. And I think that actually explains exactly what's going on when he sees the ram in the thicket. Chazal pretty much say two almost seems like totally different things when it comes to what Abraham, his first thought, what does he see when he sees the ram in the thicket? One version, Brachus Rabbah, is that he sees this ram stuck in the thicket, and all of a sudden he realizes that the Jewish people are going to be stuck in all these different types of exile. We're going to be stuck. We're going to almost like the ram. You imagine he's caught in the thicket. He breaks out a little bit. He gets caught again. He's breaks out a little bit. He's caught again. So too, we're going to move from Bavel and to Madai to Edom. All these different things, step by step by step. We're going to move from exile to exile. That's the first thing he sees. He sees a vision of the Jewish people, and they're stuck in exile. So this is like almost the moment of his triumph. He's told that he doesn't have to sacrifice his son, and immediately he sees a vision of the Jewish people in exile. By the way, that's also what happens to Avram Bris Ben Abisir, right? He also sees this moment where he's told everything is going to work out okay, but also he sees a little bit of tension, a little bit of exile. But Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says something actually a little bit different. Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says he sees the ram, and there's two different horns of the ram. This ram was created very early on in Bereshis. This is a very old ram, and there's two different horns from the ram. One horn is going to be used on the time of Har Sinai, when the Jewish people all gather together, when they're formed into a nation. And one of them is going to be used, the shofar Shel Moshiach, the shofar that blows to tell you that Moshiach has come. So on the one hand, you have Gullus, right? That's the first thing he sees. And on the other hand, he sees Geula. But I think that really what's going on here is that we're being told, where Abraham is really being told, he's saying, there is going to be a time when we're going to see Geula. There is going to be a shofar of Har Sinai. There's going to be a shofar of Moshiach. In between that time, you're going to get caught in a thicket, and you're going to think you're out. You're going to think you're going to hear the shofar from Moshiach. You're going to get caught in another thicket. Why? Because Hashem Yira'eh, Hu Haroeh v'lo Hadam. You're not able to understand always necessarily how all the different pieces work together, how everything is able to fit together. Hashem Hu Haroeh v'lo Hadam. And so actually, when you act almost in a way like you're the knight of faith, you realize exactly how we're going to bring ourselves to Geula. You just do this, you just put on tefillin, you just do all these different things. That's how we're going to get to Geula. That's missing the boat. Part of the process of the Akedah is coming to realize we don't understand what the path is going to be. We're stuck in the thicket right now. We know we have emunah. There's going to be the shofar shel Mashiach, but right now we're stuck in the thicket. And this I really think in like a little bit of a deeper way is actually what's going on in the Zechus of the Akedah on Rosh Hashanah. The source number 21, the last source, you say Amr Chanina bar Yitzchak, Kol Yimos Hashana Yisrael Ne'achazim ba'avirus. The whole time, the whole year, the Jewish people are almost like trapped in avirus, like the ram was trapped in the thicket. We're trapped in all of sort of our sins. We're trapped in our challenges. We're trapped in our tsaros. Rosh Hashanah, he notzlin shofar. But on Rosh Hashanah, we blow a shofar. V'tokimba, and we blow it. V'niskarim l'fnei Kadosh Baruch Hu, v'hu mochal lahem. We blow the shofar, and we're remembered in front of Kadosh Baruch Hu, and He is mochal us. V'sofan liyigal b'karno shalach. Shne'emar Hashem Elokim b'shofar yitzchak. And at the end, we're going to have a shofar shel ayil that's going to be the shofar of the Mashiach. In other words, even though at this particular moment where we are right now in the complications of life, we don't see a way out. We're stuck. We're stuck in our situation. We're stuck in all the different pain and all the challenges and all of the hardship that we have in this year. There's going to be a shofar shel Mashiach. We don't understand exactly how we're going to get to that shofar shel Mashiach. That's the point at the position of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. But we also recognize, right, that it's going to come and that we're not there yet. We realize kind of what we don't know. We don't know how to get to that place. That's the role of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Sometimes I think that, emunah is not really so much about having confidence, right? Emunah, oftentimes we talk about it's having complete and utter confidence that it's all going to work out. I have emunah. It's all going to work out. It's fine. I have emunah. It's going to be fine. It's just going to be okay. When you have emunah, everything is okay. We say this a lot, right? But I think the whole point of the Akedah, at least in the second way of understanding it, right, is it's not so much about knowing the answers. It's not even always about being able to figure out the answers, right? Sometimes emunah is knowing that there is an answer, that there is a kol shofar, and right now we don't know it. We're stuck. We don't know how to get out right now. We're stuck in the thicket. This year, I feel like I've had this experience over and over again as I've sort of as the situation in Israel has unfolded. I think if you growing up, at least in the generation where I did, where the state of Israel was a given. There was a given that there was a certain path. We knew how everything was going to turn out, right? There were things that were supposed to happen. There were things that weren't supposed to happen. And I remember like friends telling me the days after October 7th, like, this wasn't the plan. This is not how it was supposed to happen. And I was like, yeah, this wasn't the plan. This is not how it was supposed to happen. A couple of years, Mashiach will come. It's all good. We're all going to make Aliyah, right? But like, who told us the plan? We don't know the plan. And I think literally month after month, week after week, day after day this year, we've basically been told by Akash Baruch Hu over and over again, you don't know the plan. You don't know what the playbook is, right? And we have emunah, we know 100% there will be a shofar shel Mashiach that comes. But where we are right now, we're still stuck in the thicket a little bit. And being able to say, you know what, right now, the only thing we can do is to pray. The only thing we can do is to pray to God, open the gates of heaven, right? Open the gates of Rachamim. Because right now, where we stand, where we are right now, we don't always know where the way forward is. In a sense, that feels like that's a lack of emunah, but in a way, I think it's more emunah. Because you're saying, right, I don't know how we're supposed to act right now. I don't know what we're supposed to do. The knight of faith of Avram always knows what the right thing is to do. He always knows exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects of him. But in a way, the greater act of emunah is also saying sometimes I don't know what God wants for me. Right? When you stand there in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and say, this year, I don't know what you want for me this year. I'm working on this and working on that. I don't know what the right thing is. I don't know what to do. In a sense, that right of humility is the greatest act of emunah that we can have. So the message of the Akedah, I think, in many ways, isn't so much about the ability of planning ahead, of knowing exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us at every moment and every second, of having that confidence in what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants and what we want all the time, but rather the ability to acknowledge Hashem Yira'eh, right? But we have the ability to hear the far-off sound of the shofar, even if we don't know the way there yet. anyone have any questions? Happy to stick around and talk if anyone wants.